I can talk about GURPS combat for a long time and gush about how great it is, but there are always maneuvers and tricks that you have never seen before. In this video I would like to talk about weapon and shield binds, something that I believe was introduced in Fantastic Dungeon Grappling, but what seems to be mostly absent from other grappling systems. I wish the book actually explained or showed what a bind is, because for a person without any real-world martial skills, it might not be obvious. From what I understand, a bind is when you simply press your weapon or shield against the opponent or his weapon or shield. A weapon-on-weapon bind would be a clash, something you can see on the picture. If you play Dark Messiah of Might and Magic, then you could see it there too. First, let's check how binds work in FDG. A bind is a form of an armed grappling attack, so you initiate it by rolling against dexterity -2 or an appropriate melee weapon or shield skill at -2 to hit, applying halved hit location penalties, just like grappling normally. If you are trying to bind a weapon or a shield, this hit location penalty is -4. While a normal armed grapple, when you hold your weapon in a defensive grip and move it past the enemy, is restricted to reach C, a weapon or shield bind is not. You can use the normal reach. You deal damage as control points as normal. It is not spelled out directly, but I assume that using a one-handed weapon for a bind counts as a one-handed grapple, so you roll at -2. It's also not spelled out anywhere, but I think common sense restricts binds only to rigid weapons. Whips, cloaks, kusaris, etc. are out of luck. And flails probably should get a reduced binding reach. They do have rigid handles after all. The main difference between a grapple and a bind is that to break free from a bind you can simply retreat or move away from the attacker, if you can of course. And that's basically it. In all other aspects this works like a normal grapple, but since FDG is very short and streamlined, some special cases are left up to your imagination. For example, if you are trying to strangle an opponent with a cutting weapon, then you should deal cutting damage, not crushing. However, these rules were expanded in Shields Up. Let's take a look at them. When engaging the opponent with a shield bind specifically, you get access to another way of spending control points. You can spend one control point for each -1 penalty applied to your opponent's roll to hit, as you maneuver your shield and body to deny targets. When you wield your shield on a gauge hands-free, it is restricted to reach C and cannot be used to bind. When you hold your shield properly and on a gauge, then it costs 2 control points for each +1 to an attack roll against you if the opponent binds your shield with his shield. Yes, it's that specific. Shields Up also clarifies bind reach, and while it talks about shield bind reach, I see no reason why it wouldn't apply to weapon binds too. Basically, shield binds have reach 1, but to bind a weapon or a shield, you don't have to reach the opponent himself, just his weapon or shield. In other words, the bind reach is equal to the sum of your reach and reach of your opponent. Thus, you can bind a reach 2 spear from 3 yards away, or engage in the so-called shield fencing at reach 2, preventing reach 1 weapons from striking you. You can also bind any weapon or shield on the first turn after it was used to attack or feint you. Also, there is an important rules revision. The modifiers for binding weapons and shields have been reworked. Instead of the flat -4 penalty, it now depends on reach. -5 to hit a reach C melee weapon, -4 for a reach 1 melee weapon or a missile weapon, or -3 for anything larger. An additional -4 to bind flails. Shields as targets are treated as reach 1 weapons, but reduce the penalty by the shield's defense bonus. There are some rules that make me a bit confused. For example, Shields Up says that you establish a bind with a shield skill, but does not mention the usual -2 penalty for an armed grapple. Also, it says that you roll control points based on thrusting damage, but isn't a shield bind a one-handed grapple that should take a -2 penalty? Honestly, I do not know. There is also a paragraph that says that the point of a dagger, sword or spear can be used to establish a weapon bind at reach against a shield, and that they can be used for a disarm without a grapple. Control damage is based on thrust damage of the weapon at -2 or -1 per die, whichever is worse. This is different from the normal bind rules, because when applying a normal weapon bind, you still base your control damage on your thrust damage. The damage bonus from a weapon does not apply. The penalty does not mention the number of hands being used, so it's probably another special case that brings in more confusion. The book also introduces new defensive options. The first one is Binding Block, that allows you to establish a shield bind as part of a block. Unlike a normal shield bind, a binding block can be performed at Reach C. Your block is penalized, you take -5 for trying to bind a Reach C weapon, -4 for trying to bind a Reach 1 weapon, or -3 for anything larger. If you succeed, you block the attack and establish a 1 control point bind on the weapon, or a 2 control point bind if you have a blade trapping boss. If you lose, then the enemy may choose to hit the original target, your shield arm or hand, or deliberately strike your shield. There is also an optional rule for trapping swung blades with wooden shields, but it's a proper grapple instead of a bind. Speaking of establishing binds as a defense, Fantastic Dungeon Grappling has a grabbing parry, but it seems to imply that it actually only establishes a proper grapple instead of a bind. But these binding block rules from Shields Up seem very similar, so why not extrapolate them to allow binding parries as well? Roll a parry using the same penalties. On a success, you parry the attack and establish a 1 control point bind. On a failure, the attacker may choose to hit the original target, your parrying arm or hand, or the weapon itself. Jitte/Sai and other pronged weapons probably should either decrease this penalty by -2 or make every parry a binding parry automatically. I do not know. If you have any suggestions, please post them in the comments. Now that I think about it, why are binds limited to weapons and shields? Why can't you perform an unarmed bind? If your hand is occupied, you still can push against your opponent with your forearm or a knee, right? I would treat it as a normal bind, but using an unarmed grappling skill at -2. I find binds interesting, and I wish they existed in other grappling systems as well. There seems to be limited support for that in the default grappling system. GURPS Martial Arts has the bind weapon technique after all, but technical grappling and a new take on grappling don't seem to have any such rules. However, I think you could just treat binds as armed grapples that can be done at full reach, but can be retreated from to break the grapple. If you have any other ideas or rules, please tell me in the comments. Personally, I have never seen a bind being used in the game yet, and that's probably because I have never used FDG outside of combat tests, but it seems like a fun option. However, I also think that it requires a good deal of system mastery to be used to any good effect. I hope I got everything right in this video, but if I did not, please tell me. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.